This is the IEEE Computer Society Distinguished Lecturer Webinar Series, brought to you by the Distinguished Visitors Program. The Distinguished Visitors Program delivers tools for individuals at all stages of their professional careers through visits to chapters, offering opportunities for individual interactions, and to the membership through webinars by respected professionals. We have distinguished visitors who cover machine learning, cybersecurity, robotics, big data, cloud computing, blockchain, and cryptography, among others. Chapters can request a distinguished visitor on computer.org/distinguished-visitors. The Computer Society pays all intercity travel, while chapters are responsible for all costs with regard to the hosting of the distinguished visitor, such as lodging, transportation, and food and incidentals in the city of the presentation. The Distinguished Visitors Program is able to pay up to $1,000 for a visit to a chapter, but by working with other nearby chapters to develop a tour, that amount can be increased. So when your chapter is planning its next event, think of the Distinguished Visitors Program.
Good day, everyone. I'm Ashan Senuratne, the chair of the IEEE Computer Society's Victorian section chapter. So we are the local co-host for this global IEEE Computer Society event, and I welcome you all to the IEEE Computer Society's distinguished lecture webinar series. And this talk and the panel discussion is on online racism and in coronavirus crisis. So to start with, Kerry Cosby from Computer Society's Washington, D.C. office will go through some housekeeping, introduce our speakers, and we will be straight into tonight's panel. So Kerry, over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone joining us around the world. As mentioned, my name is Kerry Cosby, and I'm the chapter's manager here at the IEEE Computer Society. I oversee our more than 500 professional and student chapters around the world and manage our Distinguished Visitors Program. Before we get started, I'd like to get a couple of housekeeping tasks out of the way. You can ask your questions in the Q&A panel at any time. Commissioner Tan, Dr. Obler, and Dr. Gomez will answer as many questions as they can following their introductory remarks. The webinar is being recorded, and the slides and recording will be made available within a few days. Today's lecture will examine online racism in the coronavirus crisis. Now, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Chin Tan is Australia's Race Discrimination Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission, an independent statutory organization established by an act of the Australian Parliament to protect and promote human rights in Australia and internationally. He previously served as the chairperson and statutory head of the Victorian Multicultural Commission, an independent statutory authority with responsibilities to support and promote the benefits of cultural diversity in Victoria, Australia. Dr. Andre Obler is CEO of the Online Hate Prevention Institute, an Australian charity that tackles all forms of online hate and extremism. OHPI's monitoring and research outputs bring transparency to social media, while its technical policy and law reform recommendations improve online safety. Dr. Obler is a former distinguished visitor for the IEEE Computer Society and currently chairs our Global Geographic Activities Committee. He's an honorary associate in the law school at La Trobe University. Dr. James Gomez, a Singapore national, is a regional director of the Asia Center, a not-for-profit organization that seeks to create human rights impact in the Asia region. He's the convener of the Center's Freedom of Expression Project on fake news, hate speech, and authoritarian dissemination of disinformation in Asia. Before I pass the control over to the speakers, I invite you to answer a couple of poll questions that we're going to have on here. Let me put those forward. The first one is, have you experienced racism in the past month? I'll give you a few moments to answer that question. I'm going to give you just a couple of more seconds. And then our next question is, where are you currently located? Pardon the typo in that one. And I'll give you just a few more moments. Okay, and now over to Dr. Obler.
Okay, thank you very much, Perry, and welcome all. I'm going to move on to some slides to get us started. So hopefully that will now be appearing. Okay, great. The way we're going to do this is we're each going to speak very briefly, and then we'll move to questions so that we can cover more ground. So my presentation is really to set the scene, and I'm going to start by going through some data, showing you the sorts of things that we've seen in recent days and weeks. So the first slide I've got here looks at projections of racism targeting the Chinese community. And some of these have targeted China, the country, and people in China, but many of this racist content has targeted people of Chinese ethnicity located in other places around the world. So here is a post from Facebook from a group called Nationalist Alternative Australia. This is a neo-Nazi group set up from 2009. It sees itself as part of the European nationalist movement. And the message they post talks about typical greedy, selfish behaviour from the Chinese. It refers to them taking everything that belongs to us, setting up a clear us and them. And it emphasises that in this particular instance, Chinese people are the threat, and it tries to dehumanise them. It refers to them constantly taking essential items and acting like a swarm of locusts. So this is one example. The actual post behind this is to do with a particular couple of individuals that were fighting over baby formula, I think it was, in the supermarket. And it happened to be captured on film and then put on the news. So it's taking that instance of one person, one incident, and trying to make a generalisation. The next slide here is looking at a problem in relation to mosques. So what we've seen is restrictions on religious worship that affect all places of religious worship around the world, but various anti-Muslim groups have posted things from conservative news sources mostly. Sometimes they just post memes or their own content, and they focus specifically on mosques, trying to make an argument that either mosques are not following the rules or governments have made special exceptions for mosques. So the top image is from New York. It's looking at a New York mosque, which it said was open while churches are closed. The actual story, when you dig into it, is that this New York mosque was actually being used to run a food drive, which was an essential service. So that's why it was open. And when they weren't doing that anymore, in line with the emergency orders from the governor, they closed. And they actually closed before this story started circulating on Facebook. The one below it is a very similar sort of story, alleging that mosques are open when churches and synagogues and others are shut, but this time from Canada. And at the time this was posted, the rules in Toronto said that you could still have a place of worship open, provided it didn't have more than 50 people in it. And what we saw here was that this was in line with the rules. Other places of worship were either open or closed based on their own judgments, but this one was singled out. So what we've seen is these anti-Muslim pages moving to specifically target Muslims, even if the same thing is happening elsewhere. The next slide is looking at targets of convenience. So what we have here are pages that were set up specifically to be anti-Muslim, and then those pages have started posting anti-Chinese content. They're just going wherever the heat is. So what we're seeing is groups that were set up in order to cause disruption in the community, to break social cohesion, are looking for targets of opportunity. And you can see some of the comments on the side here. No jail, but shoot them in the head. Okay, that's a comment directly inciting violence. They get our baby formula, we get their insipid virus. Again, this is an anti-Muslim page. It's not even an anti-Chinese page, but they're going wherever the heat is. We've also seen a rise of anti-Semitism, with Jews being blamed for creating coronavirus. We've seen theories that Jews created the virus to harm China, to decrease world population, to profit from the harm that's caused. These are all variations on traditional, usually far right, but also in other types of anti-Semitism, but traditional anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. The image at the bottom there is from a former leader of the Ku Klux Klan, who again is talking about Jewish control of the media, etc., in relation to the pandemic. So we're seeing a lot of different types of anti-Semitism, a lot of anti-Semitism from different sections, different flavors, if you like, left-wing, right-wing, Islamist, Christian, all jumping on this opportunity. The last one I've got here is the Boogaloo movement, which is something in the United States which is calling for a second revolution. And what we found is that there's a split going on. On Facebook, the movement is anti-racist. On other platforms, it's extremely racist and has a very strong white supremacist bent. It's actually just a relabeling of the race war now sort of movement that we've seen from the far right. So this could easily turn violent. The bottom line is that there's messages of distrust, division, and blame which are circulating. It's impacting social cohesion. It's going to play into the background when people come under economic stress. The organised hate groups are growing as people spend more time online, and they're adapting to try and attract larger audiences. Some of the places, and for some of the individuals, we're going to see increased risk. This could take people that were not involved in these extremist groups and actually see them radicalised, adopting narratives of hate and then moving into violent extremism. That's the end of my bit of the presentation. I will hand over now to Commissioner Chin Tan, who I will now unmute, if I can find where the unmute button is. Kerry?
He should not be muted.
Sorry, there we go, unmuted.
Okay.
Chin, you're up.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me? Ah, great. But you can't see me, so it's no misfortune for me that you can't see me anyway. All right. Good afternoon and evening to anyone out there who's joined us. I'm very pleasantly encouraged by what Andre has reported earlier in his presentation, for the reason that he's captured some of the information that we don't necessarily have in our arsenal. In my role as the Federal Race Discrimination Commissioner, obviously, our current preoccupation is in dealing with the very overt physical and very visible nature of abuses that has come out because of presumably fear and frustration that people might have in this country and around the world about COVID-19. Our message is very clear. There's never any excuse, never, ever any excuse for racism. And the very nature of what racism is about, it's about picking on innocent people, people who have nothing to do with COVID-19, COVID-19 has got nothing to do with the Chinese in particular as a group of people to be targeted in particular, being the victim of very vicious, sometimes attacks. And we in Australia have made it very clear. I think the Prime Minister himself has come up and called out racism and said it's not acceptable. In fact, his words were, stop it, just stop it, and it's completely wrong. And what we do in the line of work that we do is to be able to deal with the racism that has occurred, but also to underpin that by a range of strategies about how we cope and cater for a society that is able to protect its more vulnerable part of the community, but to also ensure that we educate the population at large about what it is about racism that we need to be concerned about. There was a question posed to me just recently about low level of racism, and the other end of which is the extremist end of racism. And for me, there isn't a low end of racism. Racism is what it is. It is a evil of society that we need to confront and that we need to deal with. And it manifests itself on different fronts. But the very basis for which racism is to be rejected is the same. It's targeting people by virtue of nothing more than their own racial background. So in terms of what we do at the Commission, we work with the government, and we have sought funding and we have sought resources for which we can continue with having a national anti-racism strategy that will confront racism in all its form and through the different level of manifestation, including right to the point where the right-wing extremism, which has become for us a very visible and very concerning sort of area of development. Where we don't have the resources is in the area of getting data. And we made it very clear that we need to have better data, we need to have better intelligence, and this is where Andre and his group, the OHPI, has been a very, very important partner for us in trying to be able to provide the kind of resources we need that we can, in fact, use those information that are very valuable to be able to formulate policies to understand the nature of the issues that we're confronting. And the question, obviously, that's been posed to me that I'm asked to, in some ways, confirm is, has there been a rise in racism in Australia that are particularly targeted towards the Asian community and in particular Chinese community? And the short answer is there appears to be evidence to support an increase in racial activity. We have seen reports that have come out to very much verify the concerns we have in terms of the physical overt form of racism. And we're trying to obviously appreciate and understand the extent of any institutional racism that might be out there in terms of members of the population who might have a different background missing out or not being provided with the necessary services and the protection they need in our community by virtue of nothing more than because of the race or the community groups which they belong. One of the issues clearly that we are seeking to find more focused and resourcing to deal with is about online hate. Now, we haven't even begun to monitor that as extensively as we should because our preoccupation has been very much about the physical form of racial abuses that's been occurring the last few months. But I think as we move into the next few months and into the years ahead, I think the area of cyber hate, the area of online hate is going to be an area which is going to, in fact, challenge us, is going to confront us, in a way that we've never, obviously, in the past dealt with. And even in my area, when we talk about trying to confront racism, I'm very careful to ensure that at a time when most people are locked in the homes, and where the computer is the internet is the one source of expression, that we do not create a forum for which people are in fact using this in a very unproductive way to in fact defend racist activities and thoughts which they might even not contemplate in the past. And it's a challenging area. It's a new area for us in a way in which it's escalated. And I look forward, obviously, to work with groups such as OHPI and with, obviously, Dr. Gomez as well, to what he does on the national forum, international forum, to find ways to which we can do and better understand the issues we're tackling. I obviously appreciate the interest that you have expressed and the support you give. But can I say this in closing? Racism is not an act, it's an attitude. And with that carries the mindset, the belief system that we have. And it's important that we educate continually. And we start with the children at the school systems, all the way into the community, about understanding what racism is and the ill which, in fact, it causes to community. Important that we bring racism to the public discourse so we can have an honest, respectful discussion about what it is and how we can improve on the things that we do in society that will, in fact, seek to diminish and eliminate racism. So thank you all for your attention, and I hope we can have a continuing discussion as you have some questions posed towards the end of the seminar. So thank you very much for having me.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Tan. And now for Dr. Gomez.
Great. Thank you very much for having me here. My role here and the role of the Asia Center is partly to engage with OHPI and also sort of share knowledge. So what I'm presenting here today would be on the work of Asia Center. Our approach is to kind of expand it beyond online racism and look at hate speech. And what I will share with you very briefly is on what's happening in Southeast Asia. As far as online hate speech is concerned, there are two things that I think both speakers have confirmed. That there is a spike. COVID-19 has resulted in a spike in online racism, specifically in Southeast Asia. Let's say in Thailand, initially a lot of it was targeted to mainland Chinese tourists, and later on, as the infections, shifted to Europe, there was a lot of anti-European feeling as well. In Malaysia, hate was sort of, targeted at the Rohingya communities, the refugee community, and also to migrant workers, in particular undocumented migrant workers. Currently in Singapore, where I'm stationed, we see a lot of negative feeling towards migrant workers. We have over 32,000 infected. Almost 95% are the migrant workers in dormitories who have been housed in very cramped conditions. So in this study that we did, we wanted to find out, yes, we know a lot of this is happening, online, but what are the fundamentals? Because currently, the response to dealing with online racism has been, kind of from the legal approach. So, for example, France just passed the law, I think yesterday, where tech companies are held liable. So if they don't clear out content, hate content within 24 hours, they'd be liable for fines up to 1.25 million euros. Facebook, kind of wants to put another approach. They say, look, we will use AI to try to help us with moving hate speech content out of Facebook. At the same time, acknowledging it's only effective up to 60 to 70%, and further caveats that perhaps in the area of memes, that's a little bit difficult to track. So there's that shift trying to get tech companies involved. But in Southeast Asia, our study has shown that if we go below all this online stuff, there's actually, 4 key forms of hate speech that's kind of interplay in the region. Race and religion. You have xenophobia against other nationals, refugees, migrant workers. You also have hate divide over political values and ideology, and then hate against sexual minorities. So there are these 4, kind of dominant forms of hate speech that we see in the region, but the laws and policies only deal with the traditional, which is race and religion. So one key feature to observe in Southeast Asia is a new type of law called harmony laws. Singapore has, enacted it some 20 years ago and updated it last year. You have the proposal for a harmony commission in Malaysia. You have a draft anti-hate bill speech set in Parliament for the last 2 years, and nothing has moved in Myanmar. We might see some movement just before the elections in November. And also in the Philippines, they also have filed a Hate Speech Act last year. So you can see there's this dedicated move. In the meantime, all the states are using penal codes, Computer Crime Act, and internet law type of things. And COVID-19 emergency laws also gives them another arsenal. Then we look at policies. The states are introducing guidelines for religious activities, how communities should live in different areas or trying to integrate them, running integration activities, encouraging, language policies for indigenous communities and other communities, and also having, mechanisms such as Commissioner Chin's, versions of human rights institutions, as well as government agencies where, you can advocate about your identity rights. But still, all of these policies and practices are still around race and religion. So the other identities are not kind of covered. And here then we come to, what kind of identities need protection against hate, and, how can resources, both law and policies can be used. Obviously, from a rights perspective, we don't advocate, laws. We in the sense that, we want to have some regulation against, managing discrimination, but we do want to ensure there are policies in place that will build community resilience. So create compassion, get to know people better, and then in that way, we can have a society that's more resilient and tolerant of differences. So, in short, I think the laws, the legal framework needs to cover other forms of identities, and these need to be sort of trickled down into different areas of policy implementation, so we don't get stuck just on race and religion. And I think these are the fundamentals below what we see now, which is a spike in online hate and racism. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me move to our poll results. And we can see that 54% of our audience is in Australia, Southeast Asia, 8.3%, North America, 20.8%. It's more than I expected, as early as it is. Europe, 16.7%. And the next poll question. The question was, have you seen or experienced racism in the past month? 4.3% says they have in person, 17.4% have online, and 78.3% say they haven't seen it on either. So it's good that most people have not. That's very good. And I think we have a few questions for our guests. And let's see. So our first question is, government's moves in response to coronavirus, some of them using technology, have been unprecedented. James, what have we seen across the region, and what are the risks as we move forward?
I think what's fashionable these days is tracing apps. Many countries advocate for it, always with the caveat that it's voluntary, but you can see the discourse is slightly changing. That they are now saying that these apps will not work unless it's mandatory. There is often conversations or lessons to be drawn from China in terms of how that was mandatory there in their early days to try to contain the virus. So we see that tension, between having the tracing app and making it voluntary, and then the discourse moving to it won't work unless everybody is on it, and that's the tension because the space is shrinking. Privacy is being infiltrated from every corner. Many cities in the region have, surveillance cameras. They track you everywhere, even on the mobile phone. And the concern here now is with this additional feature, a lot of it won't go away once the COVID-19 measures, taper down, and that these kinds of tracing apps may then become adapted for other use, and in particular for political use, keeping some of the authoritarian regimes in power.
Okay, very good. Now, the next question: following the lockdown, many companies have adapted to using technology to work from home. For many, this will be the new normal. Commissioner Tan, what challenges will that create in tracking racism, or tackling racism? I'm sorry. Commissioner Tan, are you still with us? You may be on mute. Let me go ahead and move to the next question then, and maybe we can come back to Commissioner Tan. So what are the lessons for software companies and developers, Andre?
Okay, look, with more activity happening online and more of that activity being not just social interactions, but actually being core work within companies, within businesses, as well as interactions between companies and, companies and their consumers. The pressure on companies now to provide the technology to make sure, firstly, that they are preventing the spread of hate and preventing fake news and conspiracy theories and other issues is much higher from governments, and that's going to continue. But also there's going to be new demands coming from companies, coming from the people that are actually paying either for the advertising or directly paying for the online platforms. That means creating new functionality that actually puts customers in control, that enables them to actually moderate their audience more easily, that enables them to use artificial intelligence to try and stop some of these issues. This is all going to become a business imperative going forwards, a business imperative for the technology companies. Values around the world are also different. The standard of what's accepted and what isn't is going to vary in different countries. The nature of the hate speech is sometimes country specific. So this is actually going to mean a lot more investment is going to need to be made by technology companies, both centrally in the development of their new features, but also into the more soft side locally around the world, making sure that they have more people who are interacting with communities, with civil society, with their users, in order to work out what they need to do to keep people happy. Because if people aren't happy, they're going to jump ship. They're going to move to other platforms. So I think this is the big lesson here, is that the user experience, both for the public and for companies that use these technologies, is going to have a much stronger focus on control for managing racism and other forms of abuse. And that's going to have to become business as usual and going to have to be a much higher priority.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Obler. Do we have Commissioner Tan back?
Kerry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Great. Let me go back to that question again really quickly. So following...
I've got a question. Yeah.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
No, that's an interesting question. Undoubtedly, Kerry, we're now in this new normal mode, and the impact on the ways in which the workplaces operate more broadly, and how they manage racism. Particularly now, there seems to be a kind of upscaling of that racist behavior and conduct, particularly in the internet space. Having said that, they're not new issues for workplaces. There have been many existing obligations and protections that relate to racism in the workplaces, such as anti-discrimination policies. We have social media policies and policies relating to the appropriate use of technology. But employers do have an obligation, though, to audit existing workplace policies and ensure that they are updated to recognize the challenge of racism in the virtual workplace, and ensure that employees and managers are aware of their rights and responsibilities. And if existing policies don't fit the new work environment, there may be a need, and we are happy to look into this as well into the future, for a need for new company policies and reporting platforms. Information about new platforms would obviously need to be adequately communicated to relevant stakeholders, as in staff members, clients, customers. In some complex environments, we believe that employers may need to seek expert advice around handling discriminatory and racist conduct. Workplaces need to ensure that the employee codes of conduct reflect the changing work environment and recognize that racist behavior and conduct is never appropriate, and that racism is never acceptable in any circumstances at any time.
Okay, thank you. A couple of questions from the audience. Many of these are just for anybody, so I'm going to throw a couple of them at one of you, and then if the others have anything to add, we'll let you. Dr. Gomez, this one I'll pass on to you. This person says, I've noticed friends and family in my social media circle reposting racist messages denigrating Chinese people. It has shocked me to find out they hold these opinions. Do you have any advice on how to respond apart from defriending them? How can we help people understand the impact of their racist messages without making them even more angry and defensive?
I think there are two approaches to it, especially if that's coming on over a social media platform. I think first of all is just to report such a post. I think more and more, in spite of platforms like Facebook having community standards, increasingly, the barrier for deleting or banning those kinds of posts or suspending the users for a particular period of time is one way, because really you want to cut short the toxicity of that kind of activity. The second thing is really to engage the poster and to see if one can have a conversation. Now this is going to be a challenge here, because are we really talking to a real person, or are we talking to someone behind a fake ID who just wants to create tensions in community? We don't know what's their thinking, where they are coming from. Some people think it's funny, they want to provoke. So it becomes difficult from that point of view to engage in these ways. So and I think that's where I think we really need to pull back and have that kind of conversations of understanding other communities, having compassion and having exchanges offline. I think that's what we find. I think because the offline fundamentals were not quite there, they become they explode over online and then spike during a period of a crisis such as the health crisis we face now.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Obler or Commissioner Tan, do you guys have anything to add to that question?
I might just very quickly carry on. And the fact that people are using the internet and online, and there are, what we're finding that this is increasingly the case. People are actually doing things online they would not do with their friends or on a one-to-one level and on a personal level. This is, again, educating people the danger about being too casual, and sometimes they might even mean it, but they think it's just an expression for that moment about the certain thoughts or views they have. Again, educating people about the danger about thoughts that they have, they're expressed in a particular way to a particular medium. And secondly, assuming that the person that who has been the poster of that sort of racist comment, someone the question is, how do you bring that person to a conversation that's respectful, and they understand that you are able to, in fact, deal with the real core of the issues about racism, not about the individual, but about understanding what they have done, and to be able to have a place of a discourse where those issues are dealt with in an appropriate way, where what is going to happen in the end is to take us to a better place, where if you understand, I didn't realize the danger or the hurt it causes people, and how do we bring that about? And this is exactly the kind of campaign we're talking about in terms of the Human Rights Commission and right across Australia about saying, and Dr. Gomez has answered a lot of that question is that we don't always use laws. In a country like this, particularly, we're trying to educate people about the danger of racism and for people to understand what racism is about in the first place, and to understand that the conduct which they're in fact engaged in is not acceptable.
I'll just back up what both of the previous speakers said, but add that where it is someone, friends or family, that you actually know for real, that's social pressure. Just saying that, I don't think that's appropriate, that's probably one of the strongest forces we can have to actually change at least the public expression, to tell people that they should rein that in. It's a very different story when you're dealing with a random account online where you don't know the person, you don't know if they're a real person or a bot, you don't know if they're an extremist who might start targeting you if you respond. In those cases, just reporting and not confronting them can often be a lot safer. If it's someone you know, then it's worth speaking up.
Okay, thank you. This next one, I just love the friendliness in the question here. It says, "Hi all, J. Daniel Thompson here." Hi, Jay. I research on trolling in network society. I wonder, does there need to be greater education on how to identify online hostility, including racism? Some of this hostility is overt and unmistakable, some more coded. I'm thinking here of the Pepe the Frog meme. Thank you. Andre, would you mind starting this one?
Yeah, look, a large part of what we do at the Online Hate Prevention Institute is to educate the public on how hate is expressed. So discussing the nature of the hate, discussing the words that are used, and what we really do is we take examples and we put those examples onto our website where people can see them. We redact the names of any of the individuals, both the victims and the perpetrators, so that what we're really sharing is the message and an explanation. And, putting that out there means that people can start learning to recognise this. More recently, we've developed a program for community groups where we have booklets and activities. We have a Train the Trainer program. So we train community leaders from various faith groups and other civil society organisations. And then they can run a 2-hour session going through with a group of people from their local community, different examples which may or may not be hate speech, so both racism and other issues like homophobia or misogyny, etc. And getting people to discuss and try and identify, is this hate speech or not? If it's hate speech, who is it actually targeting? And how would you respond? So, that's the work we're doing to try and raise public awareness. But it's an education task. It needs to be done person by person, and it takes time.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Dr. Gomez, do you have something to say on this topic?
Yeah, thanks for the question and about trolling. In Southeast Asia, some of the trolling, it's organized and politicized for electoral campaign because, identity difference is used as a tool for mobilization. So even if you look, history, let's look at Thai history 40 years ago, in that contestations in the 70s, right, when they had the student uprising and the very famous Thammasat University where students were shot, students were vilified, the communists were vilified. So it was okay if you did harm to the communists, and from there you create that tension. If we fast forward to the 2019 elections in Indonesia and Jokowi, Jokowi was cast as being friendly to the LGBTI community. So this was used as a campaign tool against it, right? So that they could mobilize the other politically. So a lot of so to some extent, we also need to recognize you're dealing with organized trolling that's political money. There are internet troopers or Facebook troopers or brigade that actually actively rile up the community, and we saw some of that in the recent past in Myanmar in relation to how the crisis exploded in Rakhine State around the Rohingya. And there was enough evidence to say the military was part of it. And eventually, Facebook had to take quite a good military-associated Facebook pages down because they were seen as, spewing hate. Yeah.
Thank you. Commissioner Tan, any thoughts?
Kerry, I'll just want to add very quickly. It's a complex area. It's not new, but it is obviously offering a new platform for people to express hatred. From my perspective, from the Human Rights Commission, into my role, I've expressed a keen desire that the next few years of my term anyway, this is one area we want to focus on, the online hate, the web, the web and internet, and about education, about introducing stronger enforcement capacity and so on and so forth, and policies around this area. So I just want to add the fact that it concerns me, and it's an area which the result is equally devastating. It's deadly as well, because we've got some evidence to support the view that some of the right-wing activity that's come out from people actually getting information and thoughts from from internet, and that for me is a new area for which we need to be able to find ways to tackle and to deal with. So we're keen to know and understand more, and this is where Dr. Gomez and Dr. Obola have been very, very, in fact, helpful in the work that we do in this particular area.
Thank you very much. This next question covers an idea that is very important, I think, and this is the less overt version of racism or the ability to deny it. So the person says, what advice do the panel have for responding to hate speech that is framed with a veneer of deniability, such as it's a joke, I'm targeting a political group, not a racialized one, etc.? Most platforms enable users to report explicit hate speech, but this kind of speech seems harder to address. Any advice? And we'll start with you, Commissioner Tan.
Now, we dealt with that in various forms before, Kerry. We've had notion of casual racism, for example, issues like that about what we deem to be the lower level grade of racism, which for me is just nonsense. So it's all coming from the same pool of hatred. It's giving people a sense of false confidence that some things can be said or joked about without taking responsibility for it. But I think it's important that when we talk about these things is to relate back to the person who feels it, the victim. When we take it from that sort of focus, people get in a sense to appreciate the hurt it causes. I think it wakes people up to the realization that, I didn't realize that and I wasn't intending to hurt someone, but the fact is that someone got hurt, someone felt they were victimized by the things that's been said. I think it's an education process of learning, I now know better not to say or do things that I did before. And of course, some people will never learn and they will be quite intent to organize themselves to hate in a particular way. But I think most people have a sense of decency about these things, but it's about saying, I wasn't aware, and now I'm aware, and it gives them a sense of being able to move to a better place.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Obler, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, look, this is not a new issue. Some of the early work we did in 2012 related to a whole work with the Australian Human Rights Commission. There was a flood of content attacking Indigenous Australians, and it was done in the form of memes, racist memes. And Facebook's initial response was to say, well, let's rename the pages that are posting this and just stick a tag out the front that says controversial humour. And, Australian law doesn't have an exception for controversial humour. It's just a non-thing. Stuff is racist or it's not. If it's racist, it shouldn't be there. There isn't an excuse. So one of the issues we've had is firstly getting this understanding across that at least within our culture, we don't have an exception for racist jokes, for example. If it's racist content, it's racist content. That's the end of it. But the other side of it was one of these memes, for example, had a picture of an Indigenous person celebrating, and the text said, petrol drops to, and it gave a price, time to celebrate. And, we have an international audience here. Those in Australia will understand the problem with this. Those who aren't from Australia probably won't. The issue is that we've had a significant public health issue affecting the Indigenous community in relation to sniffing fumes of petrol as a form of substance abuse. And that's what this meme was actually about. It was promoting a narrative that Indigenous people are high on petrol fumes and are drug users. The problem is when the moderation is being done outside the country, and there'll be similar issues in all different cultures with all different issues. Unless there's that local knowledge, it becomes difficult to respond to it. And anything which isn't blatant which doesn't use, for example, racial slurs, it can become very difficult to convince the platforms to actually respond to it, particularly when you realize that the people who have to respond to the reports are normally doing so in a few seconds flat. So our response to that is to build up both our detailed reports, but also our briefings, we call them. These are usually blog post size articles where we actually break down the problem. And when we publish that, we know that the platforms are looking at our work. We have direct contacts with them. We also have friends that work in these platforms. So once we explain the issue, often there is an opportunity for action to be taken. And the media also plays a role in this. But it's a lot more labour intensive than simply hitting report and expecting the platform to be able to deal with it. One of the things I would say is funding from the large technology platforms to the people that are doing this work, as well as the people that are responding, vetting the fake news. There needs to be a quid pro quo for that work, actually funding the work that civil society is doing in order to make the platforms a safer and better place for the public, and therefore making them, more profitable for the companies running them.
Thank you. And Dr. Gomez, do you have any thoughts on this?
Just briefly about our work with Thai Media Fund. The Thai Media Fund is a government-established media literacy unit. In the last 2 years, we worked with them around literacy, around reading fake news, and given the tensions around hate speech. That's why we are doing the report, and we do community engagement. So, the key thing is resources and it's hard work. So one of the ways that we do it is actually they have this kind of roadshow around the different provinces, and we actually there are many levels from schools to so on, and I just want to kind of highlight one at the community level. So we meet up with the community. It's often hosted by a district university, so you get a chance to talk to the academics and how this can be communicated with students, but we also get to speak with community leaders and representatives from the communities. And then, there's a bit of a, mini lecture, then there's a little bit of short talks and some dance and some just casual conversations to try to kind of put up this kind of messages of community and, positive reinforcement. But it's hard work. And the approach taken in, through this literacy unit is really, they call it the ecosystem approach. So, just looking at schools, the community, the mainstream media, and so on and so forth to try to, get at it from different angles.
Okay, thank you. We're running up on the end of our time. I do want to go through one more question here. This person says, I'm from the United States. Below are topics that are discussed here today. My question is how to discuss without offending. And one of the statements is there was an issue with Zoom where there were several articles describing a security risk with respect to the Chinese government. And then it says also, likewise, there are several concerns with bringing production domestically, not China. Dr. Gomez, do you want to start that answer, if you don't mind?
I can just sort of, you mentioned Zoom, and we spoke a little bit about, also, now that we are moving to the sort of more online kind of environment, accelerated as it is, I think one of the challenges I foresee, and I'm kind of going off here, is we seem to be having, some possibility of having conversation, quite extensively over different jurisdiction and time zones through this kind of platforms, online platforms. And I think it's so far so good. But I feel that this honeymoon would be short-lived. I think this access to platform will be challenged. I think we've seen in the early days of the Zoom platform that was hacked. I myself have been. I participated in one activity that came out of Europe that was hacked, and it was a very unpleasant experience. And I foresee this safe space to chat and to discuss, even with people who are willing to have a conversation, might be disrupted, I think, sooner rather than later. And coming from a Southeast Asian perspective, I think the states will try to move very quickly to try to police and have some kind of control over this space, because these conversations are now, happening very quickly and easily cross-border. And they have done their very best to control that kind of conversations. And I foresee that for us who want to, have positive conversation to build understanding cross cultures and community, this may be a bit challenging. I'm sorry if I've gone off a little bit there tangentially, but this is my response. Yeah.
Thank you. Commissioner Tan, do you have any insights to share on this?
Gary, I've understood the question. That was more about the entanglement of various issues and how they can be discussed and decoupled. I think that's the issue about how we need to ensure that we don't conflate all the issues into one and then spin it around as a race issue. One of the things we confronted in the early days of racism that occurred because of COVID-19, there was a lot of confusion from the perpetrators about what the issues were. You get one person accusing the Chinese of all sorts of things, ranging from dictatorial, tyranny, Chinese communist system can't be trusted, to you brought us this, virus. And the thing we need to do, obviously, is, and then Australia faces increasing challenging relationship with China into the next 10 years and 15 years, is to ensure that when even COVID-19 is finished, that does not become an issue for us in trying to be able to understand that it's not about a Chinese issue, it's not about race. It's to do with the number of different issues and how we can separate those. Misinformation out there, loose talks and loose information out there about various issues that conflate it all are the ones we need to tackle and to ensure that we can have conversations about China on all range of issues or any other issues without bringing race as the one specific issues for which we then seek to make an excuse to act against someone.
Thank you very much for that. Dr. Obler.
Yeah, look, we've seen a number of examples where double standards are applied. And it's not just against China, it happens against a number of different countries. We need to be aware of that. The issues need to be discussed. Issues like foreign investment, for example, are legitimate issues for public debate. Issues related to cybersecurity, related to how much trust we can have in certain technologies. Again, these are things which experts, politicians, the public need to discuss. But that discussion can be had without doing it in a way that is racist. We just need to be very clear on when the line has been crossed. And the easiest way to check that is to just substitute another country. Take a statement that is referred to, whether it's on China or whether it's on whichever other country, change the name of the country, look at the statement and see whether that still looks acceptable. And if when you read it back, from Australia, we'd often put New Zealand in. And if the statement was being said about New Zealand, would that be, would that appear concerning? You could say, okay, well, that's a close ally. So put it in with a country that we don't have particularly strong relations with, a country at the other end of the world. Or put it in with a fictional country, let's say Narnia. If it feels wrong, then we've got a problem.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you, Commissioner Tan, Dr. Obler, and Dr. Gomez. This was a great discussion and extremely important for the moment. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the Victorian section for their help with hosting this event. I'd like to thank all of you who've attended this. We were glad to have you at this. In addition to the Distinguished Lecturer webinar series, we also have the Build Your Career webinar series that focuses on business soft skills such as communication and presentation skills, career transition, interviewing tips, among others. The next webinar in the Distinguished Lecturer webinar series will be Amlan Chakrabarty's webinar on machine learning for medical imaging analysis demystified. That was scheduled for May 28th, but it's been rescheduled to June 10th at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Dr. Chakrabarty is a professor at the University of Calcutta. On June 11th at 11 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time, Katarzyna Vak will cover quantifying quality of life of smartphone-centric humans via human-centric methods. Our next Build Your Career webinar will be on the 18th of June at 11 a.m. Eastern Time on what everybody is saying, and that'll be by Elsa Velasco-Paul, founder of the M&D Group. The registration for these are open, and we will be sending you the link for this along with the slides and the recording of this webinar. Again, thank you to our panel. You guys were great.
Well, Kerry, I want to thank and congratulate you for being an excellent host. Well done.
Thanks a lot. All right, you guys have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Stay safe.
Bye.
Thanks, bye.